The chamber was huge. It was the kind of room that made even tall beings feel small. The walls stretched up so high that the ceiling was almost invisible in the soft blue light above. Around a circular table that could seat 100, the ambassadors of the galactic conclave sat in their places. Some had 4 arms. Some had no arms at all and moved things with their minds. Some breathed gas from small tanks attached to their backs. Some were so old that their species had been traveling between stars before humans had learned to write. They had all gathered today for one reason. The Breth had filed a declaration. Ambassador Esrathvel stood at the center of the room. He was tall, even by Breth standards. His scales were dark green, and his yellow eyes moved slowly around the room as he spoke. He did not look nervous. He never looked nervous. The Breth Dominion had been expanding for 600 years, and they had never once lost a war. The beings known as humans have crossed into Breth-claimed space 12 times in the last 3 years, he said. His translator device turned his sharp, hissing words into the common tongue of the conclave. They have been warned. They have been sent notices. They have been told that those corridors belong to the Dominion. They did not listen. One of their cargo ships entered restricted space 6 days ago and was destroyed as a warning. The crew did not survive. A few ambassadors shifted in their seats. 12 human lives. It was not nothing, but in the scale of galactic politics, it was very small. "We are not here to ask for permission," Esrathvel continued. "We are here to inform the conclave that the Breth Dominion is issuing a formal declaration of subjugation against the human species. They will recognize our authority over the Kepler corridor. They will pay reparations for the time and resources wasted on warnings, and they will submit a formal letter of acknowledgement of Breth dominance. If they do not comply within 30 standard days, we will consider it an act of aggression and respond accordingly." He sat down. The room was quiet for a moment. Then slowly, a few ambassadors began to make sounds that, through their translators, came out as polite laughter. Not everyone laughed. Some were too dignified for that, but the mood in the room was light, easy, the way a room feels when the topic is not very serious. A few beings leaned over to whisper to their neighbors. One ambassador from the Pell Union turned to his aide and said quietly, "How long do you think before the humans apologize and pay the fine?" His aide thought about it. 2 weeks, maybe 3. On the far side of the table, in a seat that was slightly smaller than the others because the conclave had not yet upgraded it to full member status, sat Commander Yara Solis. She was the human representative. She was not very tall. She had dark hair pulled back tight and brown skin and eyes that did not show much on the surface. She had been sitting very still since Esrathvel began speaking. She had not moved her hands. She had not looked at her notes. When the room quieted, the conclave speaker asked if the human delegation wished to respond. Yara Solis stood up. She looked at Esrathvel. He looked back at her the way a large animal looks at something small that has wandered into the wrong place. She said, "We'll get back to you." Then she sat down. The room was quiet again, but this time it was a different kind of quiet, confused mostly. A few more soft laughs. The Thari ambassador, a thin creature with long fingers and large pale eyes, did not laugh. She watched Yara Solis very carefully and wrote something down in her notebook. The meeting ended. The Breth delegation walked out with their heads high. Esrathvel did not look back. 3 days later, in his private office aboard the Breth command station at the edge of the Kepler corridor, Esrathvel reviewed the intelligence file on humanity. It was not a long file. The humans had only been in space for about 90 years. They had a small number of ships, most of them built for cargo and exploration rather than combat. Their weapons used directed energy, which was considered basic technology. Their hulls were not reinforced with the layered shielding that most conclave species used. Their biology was soft, no natural armor, no resistance to vacuum, sensitive to temperature, prone to disease. The file described them as a Class 3 primitive species, potentially interesting in a few centuries, not relevant now. Esrathvel called in his science officer, a younger Vreth named Restal, who was known for being very thorough. "Is there anything in this file I should pay attention to?" Esrathvel asked. Restal was quiet for a moment longer than usual. He had the file open on his own screen. He was looking at something near the end of it. "There is an appendix," he said. "Appendix 7. It's a behavioral analysis. It was filed by a Thari xenosociologist about 20 years ago. It has some unusual classifications." "Such as?" Restal read from it. "Anomalous stress response under existential threat, non-standard threat processing, escalating instead of de-escalating under sustained pressure." He paused. "There's a warning marker on it." Esrathvel looked at his science officer for a moment. Then he looked back at the main file. "Soft bodies, basic weapons, 90 years in space." "They are a cargo species," he said. "They move goods between their little colonies. They have not fought anyone. They do not have the experience." Restal nodded slowly, but he did not close Appendix 7. Esrathvel stood up. "Send the subjugation notice to their home planet. 30 days. If they have not complied, we move." On Earth, the notice arrived at 3:14 in the afternoon local time in Geneva, where the United Earth Council was in regular session. The room was not as grand as the conclave chamber. It had normal ceilings and normal chairs and a coffee machine in the corner that had been broken for 3 weeks. But the people inside it were not ordinary people. They had spent their careers thinking about exactly this kind of problem. The notice was read aloud. Then it was read silently by everyone in the room. Then there was a short silence. General Amara Chen of the Earth Defense Command put down her copy of the notice and said, "Timeline. 30 days to respond," said the Secretary of Defense. "Right." She pulled up a map on the table's surface. Blue lines and red zones lit up the table. "We've had the first response fleet on standby for 8 months. The Kepler corridor approach has 2 viable entry points. We've already run models on the Vreth fleet positions. We know where their command station is." Someone at the table said, "We haven't tried negotiations." "They didn't offer negotiations," General Chen said. "They offered submission." She looked around the table. "Does anyone in this room believe that submitting to the Vreth will make them stop?" No one answered. "Then we are not submitting." The meeting lasted 4 more hours. When it ended, no press release was issued. No public statement was made. The coffee machine was still broken. But in shipyards on 3 different continents and 2 orbital stations, crews that had been resting were called back to work. Ships that had been waiting with full fuel tanks were given departure clearances. Supply chains that had been quietly prepositioned over the past year began to move. In a small city on the coast of Japan, an old woman named Hana sat in her kitchen and watched the news. Her grandson Kenji was 13 and sitting across from her doing his homework. When the reporter explained what the Vreth had sent, Kenji looked up. "Are we going to be okay?" he asked. Hana poured tea into her cup and was quiet for a moment. Outside, the sea was calm and the evening was orange and quiet. "We'll be fine," she said. "How do you know?" She looked at him. "Because they don't know who they're talking to." Kenji didn't fully understand that. He went back to his homework. On the 14th day, the human first response fleet departed Earth's solar system. It was not a large fleet by conclave standards. 47 warships, 20 support vessels, and 6 carrier platforms. The conclave observers who tracked it shook their heads. The Vreth had 300 warships assigned to the Kepler corridor alone. A Pell Union observer sent a note to his superiors that read, "The humans have dispatched their fleet. It is small. I estimate the engagement will last less than 1 standard cycle. Recommend no further monitoring resources be assigned." His superiors agreed. On the 17th day, Esrathvel received a transmission from the human fleet. There was no image, no voice, just text in the common tongue of the conclave, translated cleanly and simply. It contained two things. The first was a set of coordinates. Esrathvel looked at them and felt something cold move through him, though he would not have called it fear. The coordinates were exact. They were the location of his command station, not approximate, not estimated, exact down to the nearest kilometer. The second thing was a single sentence. "We know where you are." Esrathvel stared at the message for a long time. Then he called Restal back into his office. "The coordinates," he said. "How did they get them?" Restal's expression was careful. "We don't know. Our station has been under full communication blackout protocols for 6 months. Our position changes every 72 hours using randomized drift patterns." He paused. "By our own models, our location should be unknown to anyone outside the Dominion." Esrathvel looked back at the message. "We know where you are." "They're bluffing," he said finally. "It's a psychological tactic. They want us to feel watched." Restal said nothing. Esrathvel looked at him. "Say what you're thinking." "I'm thinking," Restal said slowly, "that I wish I had read Appendix 7 more carefully before today." Esrathvel turned back to his window and looked out at the stars. The human fleet was out there somewhere, moving through the dark. 47 ships, soft bodies, basic weapons. He told himself again that it didn't matter. But he did not sleep that night. And somewhere in the Conclave's great archive, in a file that no one important had bothered to finish reading, Appendix 7 waited quietly, full of things the galaxy was about to learn the hard way. The first battle lasted 11 hours. By every model the Breth had run, it should have ended in 3. They had sent 40 warships to meet the human fleet at the edge of the Kepler corridor. Their weapons were stronger. Their shields were better. Their ships were larger. On paper, the humans should have taken one look at the Breth line and turned back. That is what every other species had done when facing the Dominion's border fleet. The humans did not turn back. They flew straight at the Breth line. Commander Yara Solis, watching from the bridge of the carrier Endurance, had given her fleet one instruction before the engagement began. It was not a complicated instruction. It was 4 words. Don't let them breathe. The human ships did not fight the way Breth models expected. They did not form clean defensive lines. They did not try to hold positions. They scattered and moved like something wild, pushing into gaps, splitting apart and coming back together, soaking up fire that should have ended them and still closing the distance. 3 human ships were destroyed in the first hour. Their crews knew they were going to be destroyed before it happened, and they used their final minutes to pull 2 Breth cruisers out of position, creating an opening that the rest of the fleet poured through. When it was over, the Breth had lost 19 ships. The humans had lost 9. The Conclave heard the numbers and went very quiet. The second battle was worse. The Breth sent twice as many ships this time. They also changed tactics, using long-range fire to try to keep the human fleet at a distance. It worked for a while. Human ships took heavy damage. 2 carriers went dark. The Breth commander, a senior officer named Droonvel, transmitted a victory report back to Esrathvel after 2 hours, saying the humans were breaking. The report was premature. The human ships that had taken the most damage had not been trying to win. They had been absorbing fire on purpose, drawing the Breth line forward, pulling it out of formation. When the Breth finally realized what was happening, it was already done. The human fleet, which Droonvel had believed was retreating, had split into 3 groups in the dark and come back from 3 different directions at the same time. The Breth lost their 3rd fleet that day, all of it. Esrathvel received the report and sat alone in his office for 40 minutes before calling anyone in. In the Conclave's main observation tower, a room full of analysts and ambassadors watched the battle recordings on a large screen. Nobody was laughing now. The room was quiet in the way that rooms get when people are scared but don't want to say so out loud. Dr. Even of the Thari sat in the front row. She was not young. She had spent 40 years studying species behavior, and she had more gray in her pale fur than dark. She had been watching humanity for a long time. She had written the original report that became Appendix 7. She had filed it 20 years ago, and nobody had ever called her about it. The conclave speaker called her to the front of the room. She walked up slowly, carrying a slim data tablet. She did not open with a greeting. She opened with a question. "How many of you," she said, looking around the room, "have read Appendix 7 of the Human Behavioral Profile?" Nobody raised a hand. She nodded like she had expected that. "Let me tell you something about where humans come from," she said. "Not where they live now, where they came from. Their home planet Earth is not a gentle place. It never was. For most of their evolutionary history, humans were not the top predator. They were prey. They were hunted by animals much larger and stronger than them. They survived cold, disease, drought, floods. They survived all of it without the natural armor that most species develop. No thick hide, no venom, no speed advantage. They had brains, and they had each other." She pulled up an image on the screen behind her. It showed the long record of human history, compressed into a timeline. "They also had enemies," she said. "Many of them, and those enemies were not always other animals. For most of their history, the most dangerous thing to a human was another human. They spent thousands of years fighting wars against themselves. Not small conflicts, large ones. Wars that covered entire continents. Wars fought with fire and metal and later with weapons powerful enough to destroy whole cities in a single moment." The room was very still. "They did not break," Dr. Even said. "They never broke. Every time something pushed them to the edge, they pushed back harder, they adapted, they invented new weapons, they changed their tactics, they learned. That is not a normal response pattern. Most species, when faced with overwhelming force, have a hard limit, a point where survival instinct says stop, yield, live. Humans have that instinct, but they also have something on top of it, something that activates when the threat is large enough." She looked at the screen. When a human believes their family, their home, or their species is truly threatened, not inconvenienced, truly threatened, they do not de-escalate. They accelerate. The fear does not slow them down. It focuses them. It removes everything that isn't necessary and leaves only the question, "What do I need to do to survive this?" One of the ambassadors in the room said quietly, "They sound dangerous." "They are," Dr. Even said. "That is what Appendix 7 says. That is what it has always said." 3 weeks after the second battle, the Breth tried something different. It was not a fleet action. It did not involve ships or weapons that could be seen coming. It was quieter and, the Breth believed, much smarter. A biological agent coded specifically to human DNA was released into the water supply of a human colony called Myra Station. It was a planet with about 200,000 civilians on it, farmers, engineers, teachers, families. The agent spread fast. Within 5 days, people began to get sick. Within 15 days, over 300,000 had contracted the illness. Death tolls climbed. Hospitals filled. Emergency broadcasts went out. The conclave watched in silence. Some ambassadors looked away from the screens. The Breth High Council expected what they always got when they used a bioweapon: panic, diplomatic messages, requests for ceasefire, the other side begging for time to deal with the civilian disaster. They waited. No diplomatic message came. What came instead, exactly 72 hours after the first confirmed deaths at Myra Station, was a short report filed by Earth's Center for Biological Defense. The report said that the agent had been identified, fully sequenced, and countered. A working treatment had been synthesized and was already being distributed to the colony. Casualties would be limited. The outbreak was under control. The second half of the report was classified, but it leaked to the conclave's intelligence network within days. It said that the human team working on the counteragent had also produced a modified version of the original pathogen. It had been adapted, strengthened, and was now sitting in cold storage, ready if needed. The conclave's chief medical officer, a Thari physician named Dr. Sam, read the leaked report twice. Then he called Dr. Even. "They weaponized it," he said, "in 72 hours. We have been working on countering standard Breth biological agents for 20 years, and we still haven't fully cracked 3 of them. Humans have a long history with disease," Dr. Even said. "Their planet was full of it. They have spent thousands of years studying pathogens, fighting them, building immunity to them, and learning how to use them. To a human biologist, what the Breth sent wasn't a weapon. It was a sample." Dr. Sam was quiet for a moment. "They are frightening." "Yes," she said, "they are, but I want you to notice something else." "What?" "They didn't use it," she said. "They built it and they put it in storage. They haven't deployed it." Dr. Sam thought about that. "Why not?" "Because they don't need to yet," she said, "and because they have rules about what they're willing to do, even in a war. They made a weapon and then chose not to use it. That is not weakness. That is discipline." She paused. "That makes them more dangerous, not less." A Breth soldier named Gret Kor had been captured during a boarding skirmish near the second battle zone. He had been on a scout ship that had been disabled and pulled into a human carrier. He had expected death. The Breth took no prisoners in the traditional sense, and he assumed the humans operated the same way. They did not. He was taken to a medical bay. His injuries, 3 burns and a broken arm, were treated by a human doctor who did not speak to him in the common tongue but used a translation device and said, "This might hurt a little. I'll try to be fast." He was given food, real food, warm more than he expected. He was given a room with a cot and a window, no chains. The door was locked, but it was a room, not a cage. On the 3rd day, a human officer came to speak with him, not to interrogate him, just to talk, to ask his name, where he was from, whether he had family. Gret Kor answered in short, careful sentences, waiting for the trick. There was no trick. When he was eventually returned to Breth space as part of a prisoner exchange, he wrote a report for his superiors. He tried to explain what he had seen, how he had been treated, what it had felt like. His superiors read the report and labeled it psychologically compromised. They believed the humans had used some kind of manipulation technique on him, something subtle, designed to confuse and disorient. They could not accept the simpler explanation. He had just been treated like a person. In the conclave chamber, after the 3rd failed engagement, the Breth ambassador filed a new report claiming that humanity was fighting without honor and using psychological methods outside accepted conclave war protocols. The conclave speaker read the report aloud. Dr. Even, sitting in the observer's gallery, wrote something in her notebook. Later, when asked what she had written, she said she had written down the exact moment she knew the Breth had lost. Not the war, not yet, but the narrative, the story they were telling themselves about what was happening. "When you start calling the other side's strength a form of cheating," she said, "it means you don't have an answer for it." She closed her notebook. Outside the station, somewhere in the dark between the stars, the human fleet was moving again. Quiet, patient, already thinking 3 steps ahead. While the fleet fought, the diplomats traveled. It was not something the conclave had expected. Most species, when they were at war, focused on the war. They put everything into ships and weapons and supply lines. Diplomacy came after, when one side was ready to surrender. That was how it had always worked among the civilizations of the conclave. The humans did both at the same time. Yara Solis, who had been promoted to admiral after the first 2 engagements, kept her command on the front lines. But she had sent out 11 other people, not soldiers, diplomats, to every major species in the conclave. They carried no gifts. They made no dramatic speeches. They did not beg. They simply went to visit, and they sat down and they talked. The Dihal collective had never been easy to understand, even for the other species of the conclave. They were a hive mind, thousands of individual bodies connected to a shared consciousness. They did not experience things the way other beings did. There was no one DHAL. There was only the collective which thought together, felt together, and made decisions together. They found individual species confusing and slightly exhausting. Humans especially, with their constant internal contradictions and loud individual personalities, were difficult for the DHAL to process. So it was unexpected when the human diplomat who arrived at DHAL Prime was not a polished political speaker. She was a woman named Commander Yuki Tanaka, who walked into the central communication chamber, a vast room full of pale light where the collective interfaced with visitors, and sat down across from the DHAL's communication node without saying a word for almost 3 minutes. The DHAL waited. Then Tanaka opened a data file and turned it to face the communication node. It was a strategic map, complete and detailed, showing Breth expansion patterns over the last 200 years. It showed where the Dominion had gone. It showed where it was going. It showed, in clean colored projections, exactly which conclave territories sat in the path of that expansion. One of those territories was DHAL space. Tanaka did not explain the map. She let the collective read it. The DHAL were fast, they processed information across thousands of minds simultaneously, so it took about 40 seconds. Then she said, "We're going to win this. The question is whether you want to be on the right side of that when it's over." The DHAL were quiet for a long moment. When a hive mind is quiet, it is not empty. It is thinking, across thousands of bodies at once, every perspective considered simultaneously. "You are very certain you will win," the collective said, through the communication node. The voice was flat and carried no emotion. "Your species has been in space for less than a century. The Breth have been at war for 600 years. "Yes," Tanaka said, "and they've never fought us before." Another pause, longer this time. "Your certainty is unusual," the collective said. "Most species facing a larger opponent express doubt." "We express doubt all the time," Tanaka said. "We're full of doubt, but we don't let it make our decisions for us." 6 minutes passed in silence. "We will consider formal alliance," the DHAL said. Tanaka nodded. She closed the data file. She stood up to leave. "One more question," the collective said. She stopped. "Why do you fight the way you do? As individuals, why does each unit not act as part of a single plan?" Tanaka thought about it for a moment. "We do have a plan, but the plan has room in it. Room for each person to think for themselves when things go wrong, and things always go wrong." She picked up her bag. "A plan with no room in it breaks when it hits reality. We build plans that bend." She left. The collective sat with that answer for several hours. It would later say, in internal communications, that it had found the answer inefficient in theory but highly effective in practice, which was, for the DHAL, something close to a compliment. The Orin were different. They were master engineers, possibly the best builders of ships and structures in the known galaxy. Their technology was centuries ahead of most conclave species, and they knew it. They were not arrogant about it in the way the Breth were arrogant. They were simply precise. They valued precision above almost everything else. Their ships were perfectly balanced. Their weapons systems were mathematically optimized. Their supply chains ran to the second. They had watched the human fleet engagements with a mixture of fascination and deep professional discomfort. The human ships should not have worked the way they did. By Orin engineering standards, human vessels were poorly balanced, overstressed, full of redundant systems that added weight, and frequently repaired with materials that had not been designed for the purpose. In one battle recording, an Orin engineer had watched a human-damaged crew repair a blown power conduit with what appeared to be 3 different types of connector, a clamp designed for a cargo hatch, and something that looked like it had been taken from the kitchen. The repair had held for 4 hours, long enough to finish the engagement. The Oren Engineering Review Board had filed a 17-page report on this incident, titled Non-Standard Repair Methodology, Observed in Human Naval Engagement 3. The conclusion of the report, after 17 pages, was essentially, it should not have worked, but it did, and we do not fully understand why. When the human engineer named Kofi Mensah arrived at Oren Prime, he was not what they expected. He was a short man who talked fast and carried a battered personal tablet covered in handwritten notes. He had been told to try to secure an engineering partnership. He had decided the best way to do that was to be honest. He sat down with the Oren Review Board and said, "I hear you've been looking at our repair work." The board's senior engineer, a tall, silver-skinned Oren named Architect Ven, said, "We have. It is deeply irregular." "It is," Kofi agreed. "We know it's not perfect, but in the field perfect isn't always available, so we use what's there." Ven showed him the 17-page report. Kofi read the conclusion and nodded. Yeah, that conduit repair was sloppy. But it was also 4 in the morning, the ship was taking fire, the right parts were 3 decks down and full of smoke, and the engineer who did it had been awake for 20 hours. He shrugged. She kept the ship alive long enough to finish the fight. We can argue about whether it was elegant later. The Oren board was quiet. The reason our ships hold together under conditions they shouldn't, Kofi continued, is because we build redundancy into everything. Backup systems, crossover connections, workaround options. Not because we're bad engineers, because we assume things will break. We plan for the break, not just for the ideal. He pulled up schematics of a human carrier on his tablet and slid it across the table to Ven. Your ships are better than ours in almost every category. They're faster, more efficient, better shielded. But there's one thing your designs don't do well. Ven looked at the schematics. What is that? Survive badly, Kofi said. When your ships take damage outside expected parameters, they fail in ways your models didn't predict, because your models assume the damage fits within a certain range. Ours assume it probably won't. He leaned forward. We could help each other. You make our ships better. We help you make yours more survivable. Ven stared at the human schematics for a long time. The redundant systems, the crossover connections, the layers of backup power, all of it so wasteful by Oren standards, so heavy, so inelegant. But in engagement after engagement, those inelegant ships had kept fighting when they should have stopped. You would share your engineering principles with us, Ven asked. We'd work on it together, Kofi said. That's what we do, we share, we build things with people. The partnership was agreed on by the end of the day. It was the beginning of something that would change shipbuilding across the conclave for a generation, though neither of them knew that yet. The Breth, watching the human diplomatic activity, decided to put pressure on neutral species. They used trade threats, political leverage, and in 2 cases quiet coercion to convince 3 smaller conclave members to block human supply routes in their territory. It worked, or it appeared to. When the supply blocks went into effect, the human diplomatic team reported back to the United Earth Council with a simple summary. As expected. Attached to the summary was a logistics report showing supply routes that had been built 6 months ago, before the war began, running through different channels that the Breth had not been watching, because no one had thought to watch them. When the conclave's logistics observers saw the secondary routes, there was a long silence in the review room. One analyst, a young Pell officer, said out loud what everyone else was thinking. They planned for the block. A senior analyst nodded slowly. They planned for it before the war started, before the Breth even filed the subjugation notice. Nobody in the room said anything else for a while. Dr. Even, who had been present, walked out of the room and went back to her office and opened her file on human strategic culture. She flipped to a section she had written years ago and underlined a single sentence. It read, Humans prepare extensively for scenarios they believe will never happen. They call this contingency planning. It is not pessimism. It is a survival strategy bred over thousands of years of being surprised by a world that did not care whether they were ready. She closed the file. Outside her window, in the deep black between the stars, a Breth fleet was repositioning again, looking for the human supply lines it had expected to cut. It would not find them. The lines were already elsewhere, quiet and humming, carrying everything humanity needed to keep fighting. There was one other thing that happened in this part of the war, and it did not make the formal reports. A human carrier group, 8 ships, one of the mid-range task forces, went silent near the outer edge of Breth territory. No transmissions, no signal. Breth scanners swept the area and found nothing. The carrier group was listed as missing in the Conclave intelligence feeds. The Breth assumed it had been destroyed. 3 weeks later, a Breth supply depot deep inside their own territory was destroyed. Then a communications relay station. Then 2 fuel refineries. The attacks came from inside Breth space, not the border, not the edges, but deep inside from behind their own lines. It took the Breth 4 more days to understand what had happened. The human carrier group had not been destroyed. It had navigated through the Breth debris field, a belt of shattered rock and dead satellites 400 kilometers wide, officially classified as impassable, by flying each ship through it manually, one at a time, with engines reduced to minimum power, in near-total silence, guided by nothing but the skill of their pilots and hand-drawn maps built from old survey data. It had taken them 11 days to get all 8 ships through. When Esrathvel received the report, he did not speak for a very long time. He thought about the debris field. He had been using it as a natural barrier for years, confident that no one would attempt it. Every simulation said it was suicide. Every model agreed. He picked up the report on the human carrier group and read it 3 more times. Then he went to find Restal. "The appendix," he said. "Read me the section on human persistence." Restal, who had now read Appendix 7 twice in full, found the section without looking. He read it out. Humans demonstrate a non-standard relationship with the concept of impossibility. When presented with a task assessed as impossible or near impossible, a significant portion of the human population treats the assessment as a challenge rather than a conclusion. This response appears to be culturally reinforced across most human societies and is particularly concentrated in military and exploration contexts. Esrathvel listened to the words. "Near impossible," he said quietly. "Yes," Restal said. Esrathvel looked out at the stars. "They didn't do it because it was possible," he said slowly. "They did it because it was the only option they had left." Restal said nothing. He did not need to. The war entered its 2nd year. This was the part that no one in the Conclave had expected. Most wars between Conclave species ended in 1 year or less. One side overwhelmed the other, terms were discussed, reparations were paid, and life continued. The galaxy operated on a kind of unspoken rule. War was a tool, not a way of life. It was used, it ended, and then everyone moved on. The humans had not gotten that message. Or rather, they had gotten it. They simply did not operate by it. In the 2nd year, the Breth Dominion unleashed its full military weight. They stopped holding ships in reserve. They stopped worrying about other borders. They pointed everything they had at human space and pushed. Colonies burned. Stations fell. The casualty numbers on the human side climbed into the millions. And still the humans kept fighting. The Breth Psychological Operations Team had a name inside the Dominion. They were called the Voice Corps, and they were very good at what they did. In past conflicts, a sustained campaign of broadcasts showing enemy losses, cities reduced to rubble, fleets burning in the dark, body counts on bright screens, had broken enemy morale in as little as 3 months. They started the broadcast campaign against humanity, in the 4th month of the 2nd year. They showed everything, every colony that had been hit, every ship that had been destroyed. They made the numbers as large as possible, as visible as possible. They broadcast on all frequencies, through civilian channels, through news feeds, through every communication pathway they could access. They wanted the humans watching at home to feel the weight of every loss. They wanted that weight to become too much. The numbers were real, the losses were real, millions had died. 3 things happened. First, human civilian morale did drop. People were scared. Families were grieving. Nobody would pretend otherwise. There was real fear in the streets and real anger in the council chambers. Second, military enlistment on Earth and every human colony spiked. Not by a small amount. The waiting list to join the Earth Defense Forces grew so long that processing centers had to be expanded twice in 3 months. Third, and this was the part that confused the Voice Corps most completely, humans began displaying the images the Breth had broadcast, not hiding them, not suppressing them, putting them on walls, in town squares, in the entrance halls of enlistment offices. They took the Breth's propaganda and turned it into fuel. The Voice Corps commander filed a report to the High Council. Its final paragraph read, "This species has a cultural response pattern that we have not encountered before. The display of casualties and losses, which in all previous campaigns has produced withdrawal and negotiation, appears to produce in humans an accelerated commitment to continued resistance. We recommend ceasing all casualty broadcasting immediately, as it is having the opposite of the intended effect." The High Council approved the recommendation. The broadcast stopped. By then it was too late. The images were already on the walls. Dr. Even had been asked to address the conclave full assembly again. This time the room was not half empty with bored ambassadors. It was full, every seat taken, standing room along the walls. The conclave had, in the last year, moved past curiosity and confusion into something quieter and more serious. She did not begin with the present. She began with the past. She put a timeline on the screen behind her. It started about 10,000 years ago and moved forward to the present day. Along the timeline were markers, small red points, each one representing a major conflict in human history. There were a lot of markers. They came very close together in some periods. "This," she said, "is what humans did before they came to space." The room looked at the timeline. "These are not small border disputes," she said. "These are large-scale wars. Some of them involved entire continents. Some of them involved weapons that could destroy a city with one strike. In one period of about 40 years, humans fought 2 separate global-scale wars, rebuilt their civilization between them, invented nuclear weapons, and then spent another 50 years in a state of near-constant tension, where both sides pointed those weapons at each other and did not fire, not because they didn't want to, they very much wanted to, but because they were disciplined enough not to." One ambassador said from the back of the room, "They did all of this to themselves." "Yes," Dr. Even said, "over and over, and every time they rebuilt. Every time they were knocked down, they stood back up, not because their biology is special, not because they have some physical advantage, but because they have a culture built around one idea." She paused. "The idea is, we will still be here tomorrow." She turned off the timeline. "The Breth are fighting a species that has been fighting for its life on its own planet for 10,000 years. They have been losing and getting back up for 10,000 years. They have been grieving and continuing for 10,000 years." She looked around the room. The Breth expected them to reach a breaking point. There is no breaking point. There is only the next morning and what they do in it. The room was completely silent. "I want to be clear," she said. "I am not saying humans are invincible. They can be beaten. They can suffer. They can be hurt very badly. What I am saying is that hurting them is not the same as stopping them. And if you hurt them enough, you will not slow them down. You will make them permanent." In the third month of the second year, a Breth fleet destroyed the human generation ship Kalisto. A generation ship was not a warship. It was a slow, large, fully civilian vessel built for the purpose of carrying families to new colony worlds. The Kalisto had been traveling between two human colony systems, carrying 4,000 people. Most of them were families. More than 1,000 of them were children. The Breth fleet that destroyed it knew what it was. It was not an accident. It was a choice. The same kind of choice that had produced the bioweapon. The Voice Corps had advised it, a strike on a civilian target, large enough to be undeniable, intended to send a message about what humanity stood to lose if the war continued. The message was received, but not in the way the Voice Corps intended. Within 48 hours of the Kalisto's destruction, every human fleet in the galaxy changed its tactical designation. It happened on all carriers, all warships, all support vessels, across every human military command, simultaneously. The new designation was broadcast openly, on all frequencies, so that anyone listening, friend or enemy, would hear it. The new operational name was Remember the Kalisto. No further explanation was given. In the Conclave Observation Gallery, an elderly Thari diplomat named Sir Roland had been watching the war feeds every day for 6 months. He had seen a great deal in his long career. He had watched species fight and break and rebuild. He had sat through 100 negotiations and a dozen wars. He turned to Dr. Even when the new designation came through on the feeds. "They just made it personal," he said. "It was already personal," she said. "Now they've named it." He looked at the feed for a long moment. "What does that mean for the Breth?" "It means," she said quietly, "that the Breth have given humanity a story, and humans with a story are the most dangerous thing in the galaxy." Esrathvel had not slept well in months. He had been removed from direct fleet command after the second year's early battles, elevated to a senior advisory role that was, in practice, a way of keeping him involved while removing his influence over actual decisions. The Breth High Council was frustrated with his recent reports, which they characterized as defeatist. He had used words like reconsider and reassess in his last 3 documents, and each time been met with cold silence. He did not stop thinking, though. He sat in his office every night and studied human history. He had found a conclave archive of translated human texts, history books mostly, but also stories, letters, speeches. He read them all slowly, with a translation device, trying to understand something that kept slipping past him every time he thought he had it. He found a speech given by a human leader during one of their many ancient wars. The leader's nation had been nearly destroyed. Their allies had fallen. They stood almost alone. The speech had been given on the radio, an old technology, so the leader's face could not be seen, only the voice. The translated words read, "We shall fight on the beaches, we shall fight on the landing grounds, we shall fight in the fields and in the streets, we shall fight in the hills, we shall never surrender." Esrathvel read it 3 times. He did not understand the speech as tactics. He understood it as something else, as a kind of declaration that was not addressed to the enemy at all. It was addressed to the speaker's own people, to remind them of who they were, what they were made of, what they had decided to be. He thought about the Kalisto. He thought about the broadcasts the Voice Corps had tried and failed. He thought about the carrier group that had flown through an impassable debris field because there was no other option. He pulled out the document he had drafted 3 months ago, the one titled Reconsideration, and opened it. He began to write again. This time he did not use careful words. He wrote what he actually believed directly, without softening it. He wrote, "We cannot win this war. We have already lost it. The question is not whether we will lose, the question is how much we are willing to destroy in the process of learning something we could have learned by reading a file." He sat back and looked at what he had written. Then he encrypted it, gave it the highest security clearance he had access to, and sent it to every member of the Vreth High Council. This time, they did not respond with cold silence. They removed him from his position entirely. 2 days later, the High Council approved an enormous new fleet action, the largest single military deployment the Dominion had made in 2 centuries. Every available warship, every reserve fleet. A final, overwhelming strike on humanity's core systems, designed to end the war in one decisive blow. Esrathvel sat in his new, smaller office, no window now, no view of the stars, and read the deployment order. He thought about Appendix 7. He thought about the speech on the beaches. He thought about a grandmother in a kitchen telling her grandson that it was going to go badly for them. He folded his hands together on his desk. And then, for the first time in his long military career, Esrathvel did something he had never done before. He was afraid. Not for the Dominion, not for the war or the politics or what would happen to his career. He was afraid for his people. Because the High Council had just pointed a fleet at a species that had been preparing for exactly this moment for 2 years. A species that planned for things they hoped would never happen. A species that, when hurt badly enough, did not break. They accelerated. And the fleet was about to hurt them very, very badly. The Vreth called it the final drive. 712 warships plus support vessels, plus carrier platforms. The largest assembled fleet the Dominion had put into space in over 200 years. It was, by any measurement, an overwhelming force. Even the Conclave's most senior military analysts, who had spent 2 years watching humanity perform the impossible, looked at the numbers and went quiet. The fleet admiral commanding the final drive was a Vreth named Hesko. He was not like Esrathvel. He did not read history files and he did not send cautious reports to the High Council. He believed in simple arithmetic: more ships, bigger weapons, faster victory. He had been chosen precisely because he was not complicated. The High Council had decided that complicated thinking was what had cost them the war's momentum, and they wanted someone who would simply go. He ordered the fleet to form up and move. In the Conclave observation tower, the feeds lit up with the fleet's movement. Ambassadors and analysts crowded the screens. The final drive was not being done quietly. The Vreth wanted it known. They wanted the Conclave to watch. They wanted humanity to see what was coming. Dr. Even was there. She watched the fleet assemble and then she sat down, very calmly, and began to write in her notebook. Sir Roland, the elderly Thari diplomat, sat next to her. "You don't look worried," he said. "I'm not," she said. 700 ships. "Yes," she kept writing. "You believe the humans are ready for this." She looked up from her notebook. "I believe the humans have been ready for this for 2 years. I believe they have been waiting for this. And I believe that fleet is about to walk into the most carefully built trap in the history of this galaxy." Sir Roland looked at the screens. "How can you be certain?" She put down her pen. "Because that's what humans do when they know something is coming. They don't run away from it. They use the time to prepare. And the one thing they have had in this entire war is time." She picked her pen back up. The Vreth spent 2 years trying to overwhelm them. The humans spent 2 years getting ready. The trap did not look like a trap from the outside. The human fleet that moved to meet Hesko's final drive was smaller, visibly smaller. 160 warships, plus the Dihal allied vessels and 3 Oran-built support carriers, which gave the humans certain engineering advantages they hadn't had before. To any observer watching the numbers, it still looked lopsided. 700 to 160, even with the Allied additions. Hesko saw the human fleet on his screens and allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. He had expected them to bring more. This was going to be simpler than he thought. He ordered the attack. What happened in the next 4 hours was not a battle in the traditional sense. It was a demonstration. The human fleet engaged the front edge of the Vreth formation while doing something that, at first, made no tactical sense. The engagement was light, Contact was brief. The human ships pushed in, fired, and pulled back, keeping the Vreth formation moving forward, always forward, toward a specific region of space near the edge of the Kepler corridor. HFY pressed harder. He ordered more speed. He could see the human line bending, pulling back, seemingly about to break. Then his comms officer said in a very strange voice, "Admiral, the supply stations." HFY turned. On his secondary screen, the Vreth supply network across the entire Kepler corridor had gone dark. Not one station, not two, all of them. 17 supply depots, 8 fuel relay points, and 4 ammunition platforms, all offline simultaneously, all at the same moment. "What happened?" he said. Nobody answered for a moment. His engineering officer ran the diagnostics twice, then a third time. Finally, she looked up and said in the same strange, flat voice his comms officer had used, "There are foreign objects inside the systems, physical sabotage, placed inside the hardware deep in the mechanics, not detectable from the outside." She paused. "They are not new." "How long have they been there?" HFY said. She checked the readings. Based on the material degradation around the placement sites, at least 6 months. The bridge went very quiet. 6 months ago, the Vreth had believed they were winning. 6 months ago, no human ship had come anywhere near those supply stations. Or so they had believed. The human carrier group that had slipped through the impassable debris field and spent 3 weeks behind enemy lines had not only been hitting visible targets, it had been doing something quieter, something that required patience and precision, and the ability to plan for a moment that would not come for half a year. The human fleet had not been trying to win the engagement with HFY. They had been hurting him, moving him forward, away from his own supply lines, into a region of space where his fleet could not resupply, could not refuel, could not sustain a prolonged engagement. 700 ships needed enormous amounts of fuel and ammunition. Without the depot network, the final drive had, at maximum, 11 hours of effective combat capability before its effectiveness began to drop rapidly. On the human carrier Endurance, Admiral Yara Solis looked at the tactical board. Everything was exactly where it was supposed to be. "Now," she said. The Allied fleet came from 3 directions. The DHAL Collective brought 60 ships from the northern approach. The Oran-Human Engineering Partnership had, over the previous 3 months, retrofitted those ships with a new shield design, one that combined Oran precision with human redundancy. They could take damage that should have ended them and keep operating. From the southern approach came a second human task force that had been running dark for 8 days, completely off all conclave tracking systems, waiting. From directly ahead, the original human fleet stopped retreating and turned around. What followed was not quick. It lasted 9 hours. The Vreth fought hard. HFY was not a complicated man, but he was not a coward, and his fleet was made of experienced soldiers who did not give up easily. Ships burned on both sides. The cost was real. But with every hour, the Vreth supply situation grew worse. Ships began running low on power. Weapon systems started cycling at reduced capacity. Coordination broke down as comm relays failed one by one. The human fleet did not rush. It did not push for a dramatic final strike. It simply maintained pressure, steady and unrelenting, like something that had all the time in the world. Because it did. In the 9th hour, HFY's flagship went dark. 2 hours after that, the Vreth fleet, or what remained of it, signaled for ceasefire. The peace talks were held in the conclave chamber. Admiral Yara Solis read the human terms from a single sheet of paper. She read them standing without ceremony. The terms were not gentle. The Vreth would withdraw from all contested space, return all captured human prisoners, and pay structured reparations over 20 years. But they were also not designed to destroy. The Vreth Dominion would continue to exist. Its people would not be punished for what their government had done. When she finished reading, the Vreth ambassador, not Esrathvel, someone new, someone young with no wars on his record, said that the terms were acceptable. There was no cheering from the human delegation. Solis folded the paper and put it in her pocket and sat down. Her people looked tired. Not the good kind of tired, the deep kind, the kind that doesn't go away quickly. The Vreth ambassador noticed this. He wrote it down in his personal notes later that night. He wrote, "They did not celebrate. They looked like people who had been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and who had finally been allowed to set it down, but they did not look happy about how far they had carried it." Dr. Even was asked to give one final address to the conclave. She took her time getting to the podium. She looked older than she had 2 years ago. Everyone in the room did. "The war is over," she said. "The humans won. But I am not here to celebrate that. I'm here to ask the conclave to think carefully about what we all just witnessed." She looked around the room. "We have spent 12,000 years building this conclave on the principle that war is primitive, that intelligent species should resolve conflicts through diplomacy, economics, and negotiation. That principle is not wrong, but we applied it incorrectly. We assumed it was universal. We assumed that every species in the galaxy had arrived, as we had, at a place of peace through comfort, through never having been truly threatened." She paused. The humans did not get to that place. They came from a world that never gave them the luxury of comfort. They came from a history of constant struggle. And when the Vreth brought that struggle back to them, they did not respond the way we expected. They responded the way their entire history had prepared them to respond. She took a breath. "They are not a danger to this conclave. I want to be clear about that. They have allies now. They have shown in this war that they value friendship, that they treat prisoners with dignity, that they build rather than destroy when given the choice. The human aid teams are already on Vreth civilian worlds, helping with the infrastructure damage. They are feeding people who were shooting at them 6 months ago." She let that sit for a moment. "What I am asking you to understand is this: they are not a danger to us, but they are a reminder. They are a reminder that peace is not something that exists automatically, that it has to be built and maintained and earned every single day. The humans know this because they have lived it. We forgot it because we were comfortable." She gathered her notes. "I suggest we do not forget it again." In the months that followed, the conclave's intelligence agencies did a full review of every species classification file in their archive. It was long, careful work. Hundreds of files were reassessed. New data was applied. Old assumptions were questioned. The methodology they developed for the new review process had an official name in the documentation. But among the analysts who worked on it every day, it was called something else. They called it the human margin, the gap between what a species appeared capable of on paper and what it became when it had no other choice. It was, the analysts agreed, the most important thing the war had taught them. Not tactics, not technology, not fleet formations. The lesson was, never assume you know what something is capable of until you have seen it with its back against the wall. On a small neutral world called Teva Station, a refugee settlement had been built to house Vreth civilians displaced by the war's final battles. The settlement was temporary, mostly prefab structures, but it was safe, and it had clean water and food. A human aid worker named Lena was assigned there. She was 22 years old. She had signed up before the war ended and arrived after the ceasefire. She had never been in a battle. She had only seen the war through screens from far away. The children in the settlement were shy at first. They were Vreth children, small, with the same green scales as their parents, with yellow eyes that watched everything. They had heard stories about humans, large, strange, impossible to predict. Lena sat with them in the morning and taught basic reading in the common tongue, using whatever paper and chalk she could find. In the afternoon, she helped with construction. She was not an engineer, but she could carry things and hold things in place while the real engineers worked. One afternoon, a boy named Breth, 8 years old, with a small scar on his jaw from the evacuation, sat next to her while she was taking a break. "Why are you helping?" he asked. He said it simply, with no hostility. He just wanted to know. Lena thought about it for a moment. "Because the war is over," she said. He thought about that. "But we were your enemies." "Yes," she said, "but you're not now." He was quiet for a while, then, "But your people died, a lot of them because of us." She was quiet for a moment too. "Yes," she said, "a lot of them did, and we're not pretending that didn't happen. We remember it, we'll always remember it." She looked at the settlement around her, the prefab roofs, the children playing near the water station, the Oran architects at work on the first permanent building frame. But surviving was never just about beating something. It was about having something worth surviving for, a tomorrow worth living in. She stood up and brushed chalk dust off her hands. "So we build it." She went back to work. Breth sat for a while longer and watched her. Somewhere in the conclave's deepest archive, a file had been updated. The file was the human behavioral profile, the same one that had been reviewed and mostly dismissed before the war. It had grown considerably. It now ran to 412 pages. Most of those pages were new, written by analysts and observers in the last 2 years, full of battle records and behavioral notes and strategic assessments. At the very top of the file, someone had added a new header. It was printed in the conclave's 17 official languages, one after another, so that there could be no confusion. It read, "Do not engage without full review." Below that, in small, plain letters in human script, written by hand by some unknown person, an archivist, an analyst, a soldier, nobody ever found out, were 4 more words. They read, "They warned you, you laughed.